At the Lost Gardens of Heligan, the biggest garden restoration this century in Europe is underway.
But actually, it wasn't that tree we wanted. It was very good, but...
100 years ago, these were amongst the most beautiful gardens in Cornwall. Then the First World War put an end to a way of life unchanged for centuries. Of the 22 garden staff that worked at Heligan, over half perished in the fields of Flanders. It was the end of an era for Heligan, and a pattern that was to be repeated in country estates all over Britain. With the death of the gardeners, many of the craft skills that kept the gardens alive died too. The Tremaine family, who'd owned this land for over 350 years, lost heart in their gardens and left. Gradually, Heligan fell quietly to sleep until 1990, when John Willis inherited the land from his grandfather, a Tremaine.
My reaction going round it was amazement and excitement. I mean, there was this wonderful place, all desperately overgrown. It had the feeling that no one had been into it for donkey's years, and to a large degree that was true. It was my first opportunity to explore it. And the reaction was, this is wonderful, we must do something with it. The problem was what?
You sure this is the way?
Yeah, I pretty well, think I've got my bearings here.
While we were still trying to work out what exactly to do, I, more or less by chance, met Tim, and before I had to tackle the question of exactly how to do it, it gelled itself when we walked around and ideas grew from there.
That'd be lovely to open it. We've got to open it up again, haven't
Well,
we?
we'll open it up again, most certainly, yeah.
Tim Smith had recently moved to Cornwall, leaving behind his career as a music producer in London. Heligan offered him the opportunity of a lifetime and the chance to return to his earlier love, archaeology.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Imagine, no one has seen that for, what, 150 years?
Quite amazing, isn't it?
After the first impressions of it being hideously overgrown, it was a wonderful day that will live with me forever, and I think you genuinely had a feeling of discovery, that you cut through the brambles and the laurel, and just at the point that you were flagging each time, you'd come across a structure that caught your imagination, but every so often you had these amazing bursts of colour where one of these rhododendrons had burst into flowers. It was very exciting. I mean, it took me back to my childhood, you know, sort of the days of, you know, reading The Secret Garden, Peter Rabbit, I suppose. And that feeling is actually what inspired me to fall in love with it, I'm sure of it. It wasn't to do with horticulture or anything like that. It was to do with the feeling of finding secret places that had stories that, you know, maybe you'd never know, but you could let your fantasy run riot with it. To me, the most powerful moment was finding the doorway and seeing a chink of light through it, and then poking through, you could see the brambles completely covering everything. I think the most startling thing was, in fact, as you looked through, you saw the finial top of the old orchid house, which was completely gutted and covered in brambles. And that somehow captured that sense of sadness of a period gone, and yet that little bit boldly sticking through.
Shortly afterwards, John Willis made the decision to lease the land to Tim and John Nelson. John was to become the other half of an enduring partnership. A local builder, he had the practical skills to make the dream a reality. The house was not included in the lease. In the 1970s, it was converted into flats and sold off. What they did take on was a wilderness that most sane people would have found daunting.
I think the reason it really worked between me and Tim was because it was rather strange that we were both entirely different fields, but that's probably the reason it did work, was the fact that I was the one that could get out and do it, and Tim made sure I had what I needed to do it with, which I think you couldn't have done one without the other. It was very important between the two of us.
Once we decided we were going to do it, John and I asked several contractors to come and quote to do the clearance. Do you remember that?
We did, yes.
And they all came, and they were so frightened of it that they wouldn't quote, because they thought that if they made a quote which was written and they couldn't follow it up, it would make them go bust. So John said to me, he said, look, Tim, why don't we clear 1 acre? Measure it out and do 1 acre, didn't we? And then we'd have some idea, in terms of scaling it up, how long it would take. And I know it sounds like a joke, but we started and just never stopped.
I think what it was the way we started, literally more or less on my own, and I'd learnt the hard way. Once I'd done that and help came along, it really did make it 10 times easier.
We had a lot of good friends helped us, though. I remember that really well.
I think that was brilliant, because they really were what we were looking for, that big heave on.
Do you remember that? I remember I was looking at the diary the other day. You know, that was June the 5th, 1991. I think that was the most exciting day we ever had here, which was we cleared 100 metres of road in one day.
Yeah.
1 day, with a dumper truck at one end. We'd have a whole team, you know, cutting down the edges of the path, rolling it up like a carpet, then cutting it again, bunging it in the dumper, keeping going, keeping going, keeping going. It was just amazing to think that, you know, at 7 a.m. in the morning, it was completely overgrown. And by 7 p.m. that night, you could actually get back the feeling of a view, a long vista underneath all those rhododendrons. That was as good a feeling. That was great, wasn't it? Yeah.
The skill of the former gardeners soon became clear.
I find it extraordinary. There isn't a single example in the whole path network of a tree growing through the main hard path. And we do know from the writings of the head gardener at the turn of the century that every autumn it was part of the job of the gardeners to sprinkle sea sand from Pentuan onto the paths, just enough so that it would keep the weeds down. So that undoubtedly has had a big impact on not allowing any root penetration, because you got build up over years and years and years.
In its heyday, Heligan was a 1,000-acre Cornish estate that stretched down to the fishing village of Mevagissi. The gardens were surrounded by home farms and woodland, making the estate self-sufficient. The pride and joy of the Tremaine family were their 57 acres of designed gardens, created by 4 successive generations, from the 1750s to the early 1900s. On the northern side of the house are the oldest gardens, 35 acres of pleasure grounds that date back to the mid-18th century. In the middle are the productive gardens, which supplied the food all year round to the inhabitants of the big house. Beyond the lawn is the jungle, a 22-acre Victorian creation, offering a taste of the rainforest, where subtropical plants thrive in its sheltered valley location. Restoring the gardens created a dilemma. If a landscape has evolved over many years, to which period should it correctly be restored? The Lost Valley presents a unique challenge. 30 acres of ornamental woodland, originally planted over 250 years ago.
Now, for us, the great challenge when we discovered Heligan was to ascribe particular features to a particular period. It was very, very difficult. It's those plates of time that really make Heligan exciting, because you never know what's around the next corner.
Morning, Charles. Well done. Getting better, mate.
One of the biggest surprises was John's discovery of the ravine, the ultimate in Victorian artifice. The fashion of the day was to recreate wild settings to provide a dramatic backdrop for the rare specimens being brought back by the plant hunters.
And there was a bad couple of patches further down. The ravine, it looked like a giant mound, which was always curious about, but we hadn't really done nothing about to find out what it was. And then one day my dog went for a walk, disappeared, and she was well trained. She'd always come back every time I called her. This time she didn't. She just kept on barking, so wandering across, I rummaged around. I could still hear her, but couldn't see her, and then ended up with her in the pond down there. I'd fallen right through. What had happened, the trees had fallen across, the brambles had gone straight across on top, and ivy and everything else, and a period of nearly 70 years of fallen leaves had formed a roof right the way across the whole ravine. And then we started clearing and we came across some rather strange sights. We found the waterfall and we gradually worked our way up these little pools to a pyramid rock up there and found a pipe sticking out. And then we started finding strange stopcocks. It meant that we'd actually found in the ravine the whole water system for Heligan.
The chance finding of the ravine led to the biggest underground discovery at Heligan, the ram pumps, a complex water system crucial for maintaining the estate.
It was all fed from 1.5 miles down the valley, pumped up by what they call hydraulic rams. Wonderful structure in itself. And then gravity fed right the way down through the gardens and to the big house. So they had a marvellous water supply. Last summer, boiling hot summer, every garden in Cornwall was very concerned, no water. We were lucky. We'd gone to the trouble of restoring the rams, so we had countless amount of water. And that's why Heligan's looking so beautiful today. We would have lost a lot of trees without them.
The combination of moisture and dappled sunlight in the ravine provided near-perfect habitat for wild primroses in the spring and a vast collection of rare tree ferns. But this is a far cry from the original intention.
Here we are in about 1880, 1890, and we're looking at what we now call the ravine, the so-called Himalayan mountain pass, which was, of course, designed in its earliest days as a rock garden, an alpine garden. I have to say that the plantings don't look as if they were particularly pretty, but it was quite an ambitious project nonetheless, because we worked out there's over 2,000 tons of stone being brought into this ravine. And this, of course, is a classic area for us to consider when it comes to the restoration of it. Do you leave it as you found it in the photographs, or do you leave it as it has become? And we took the view, having searched our hearts in terms of restoration ethos, that we wanted it to become what it had become, not what it was, because by accident the great ash trees that had grown through this rockery had created the perfect environment for English ferns and spring flowers. So we decided to, if you like, enhance what it had become and get rid of the alpine garden. But it's a very charming place.
The regeneration of these gardens has captured the imagination of its paying public. Heligan is now the most visited private garden in Britain.
Come on, you lot in the cheap seats. You're not here to enjoy yourselves. Well, hello and welcome to the Lost Gardens of Heligan. I haven't met all of you. My name's Tim Smith. I'm the project director. And what I'd like to do is take this opportunity to give you some of the lowdown about Heligan.
Drop them there anyway, and I'll have a look at them in a minute.
Well, the whole ethos of what we're about is to tell the story of those ordinary men and women who made these places great. And to do that, you can't do it as if you wanted to do history and aspect. This isn't an exercise in nostalgia. What we want to do is to make it live. We want to actually grow the plants that were grown here. We want to grow them in the manner in which they were grown here. And we want to taste them. We want to eat the stuff. We want to get a real feel for what it was like. I think that's what people like when they come here, because they get a feeling as if they're going back in time, but not in one of those theme parky sort of ways. They're actually seeing the good that was going on then being reproduced. The very strange thing that anybody who's ever been to Heligan will tell you, especially in the early days, is that it really felt as if someone had said, last one out, turn the lights out. The atmosphere was as if something had happened, everybody had gone away, and no one ever returned. And that was it. Sounds odd for a grown man to say it, but I don't like being at Heligan at night, not when the sun has gone down. Everybody will tell you about the sound of footsteps they hear, and the silence is so thick you can cut it with a knife. It's extraordinary. It's like there are some silences which are calm and quiet, like a going to rest. But this is a silence which is almost seething. I can't explain it. I'm not sensitive enough to be able to put my fingers on what it is, but it's as if there's something walking around here. Not evil, just sad, very sad.
These 4 acres of kitchen gardens are the engine rooms of this Cornish estate. At the turn of the century, they supplied the Tremaine family and their staff with all the food crucial to their survival. Now they are the only fully restored working walled gardens in Britain. The flower garden grew flowers for cutting, salad vegetables, and produced exotic fruits in its range of glasshouses. The vegetable garden provided basic foodstuffs all year round. The most labour-intensive area of the Heligan estate, 18 of the 22 gardeners worked here. Today there's a staff of just 6. Between these 2 gardens is the melon yard with its cold frames and vines. In Victorian times, the head gardener would have been in charge of all this. It was one of the most prestigious positions a working-class man could aspire to. Philip Macmillan Browse is today's equivalent. He has to fathom out the methods his predecessors used to grow their food, such as how they produced pineapples thousands of miles north of the equator without glasshouse heating.
See, that's not bad. We've got 8 in now in 20 minutes, and we only had about 1 in 12 minutes, didn't we? And put 4 in a row and give them wider spacing.
So we have aisles, in other words?
Yes.
Okay. We could do that.
In the finest traditions of the head gardener, Philip has no intention of getting his hands dirty. His right-hand man is Tom Petherick, who in the role of foreman carries out his instructions.
The complexities of what a head gardener would have had to face with the actual guy who had to get in and do it. I mean, there is a limit to whether you could physically get in there or not. So the guy who's going to run it is going to put it to the spacing that he can get away with. And yet the head gardener is going to say, shove them up, so they're forever probably behind one another's backs, compromising all the time. I think that's going to be the answer.
Yeah.
Bringing these gardens back to life is not just an exercise in nostalgia. The aim of the team is to mirror precisely the methods of the generations of Heligan gardeners before them.
When you think of how fast this operation has developed in the whole gardens, we are achieving things at really quite a phenomenal rate and learning very fast. Our learning curve of everybody who works in the gardens, whoever the gardeners are, their learning curves have been enormously steep. Because it doesn't matter how much you think you know about gardening, we knew nothing about Victorian gardening. We had to put ourselves in the position of being Victorian. When we first came into the melon yard, you just saw these and thought they were frames. Nobody had any idea that they particularly were pineapple pits at the time, and they were totally derelict. But the most impressive thing I remember is that about 2/3 of the way down here in the manure pit on that side was an ash tree, and one of the major efforts of this restoration was not rebuilding the frame, it was actually getting this huge ash bowl out in the first instance. And I look back on that and think that that sort of thing was the major achievement of the restoration. Building it up and putting it right afterwards was chicken feed compared with some of the original recovery work that had to be done.
The old Heligan gardeners were horticultural pioneers. Some of the pineapples they grew in this pit weighed as much as 18 pounds. With no heating other than stable manure, It was little short of a miracle.
This is probably the oldest method of growing pineapples that would have been used, and I suspect that this is the only pineapple pit heated in this way that's extant in Great Britain at the moment. We're heating it with the hotbeds, which go through this divided wall, this hollow wall. Heat goes in at the bottom, rises, and then comes into the frame through the pigeonholes at the back and the front. In the old days, they would have used stable manure. Because it's got a lot of urine in it, it's got a lot of nitrogen in it. So consequently, it'll fire up. That is, it'll start to heat up and ferment very quickly. You want it to give a consistent heat for as long as possible.
It's a bitterly cold winter, but the vegetable garden, as in the days of the Tremaines, has produced enough greens to feed an army. It's helped by the addition of a natural ingredient from the local beech. Just like the Victorian foreman, Tom Petherick works alongside the garden staff.
Well, this is Portmelon Beach, where we come regularly to collect seaweed. And it's good conditions, really, because there's half a southerly gale blowing, and that blows right in here and brings the seaweed, well, not up as far as the beach as I'd like it, but still, there is plenty of seaweed around. And we should be able to fill our tractor and trailer, get it back to the gardens by lunchtime. We use it for a number of things. Mulching, for making compost. Very labour intensive, takes a long time, but the benefits are there. It's adding organic matter. Medium, which is ideal for plant growth. The head gardener had to extend the season in order to please the house. And of course it was great. It was a great benefit to the host to be able to, bring things into the dining room that his guests mightn't see if they lived in another part of the country, especially in the north of England. So these are our sea kale beds, and we're playing around with nature here a bit. We're trying to force them not out of season, but we're trying to wake them up from their winter dormancy, so they give us an early spring crop. By putting the lids over and the pots, we're getting, we hope to get nice blanched shoots by cutting out the light. And these will be much sweeter than they would if they were a normal green colour. They're from the brassica family, and they're tough, leathery old leaves and not particularly flavoursome. But when they're white and blanched, they're very sweet. What this does mean is that they lose quite a lot of their vitamins because they have no chlorophyll in them. So they're lacking in I think it's A and C, but they are very sweet, and they were a typical Victorian crop. They're not seen much these days. And we hope to get something by the early spring, when the soil temperatures warm up a bit, with the help of this insulation from the straw. So with a bit of luck, we'll get something fairly good. It's now time to see whether we've got any and whether it's nice and white, as it should be. That's just how it should be. Very pale, creamy colour, not much leaf. You see, it's going out towards the light. Hasn't put on any leaf growth at all because it can't see the light, so it stays white. And this is the bit you eat. Don't tend to eat that bit, although you can. But that's the bit you eat, and it's steamed or boiled lightly, and it's quite sweet, very tender, and well worth all this trouble. And if you do have these forcing pots, an old bucket will do. I mean, you can use anything as long as you keep the light out, just let in a crack so it can just grow a bit. That's the secret. That's just how we wanted it to end up. It's perfect.
I suppose we're growing 180 varieties of vegetables from seed. These are the seeds of the vegetables and flowers that we use in the garden currently. The complete collection, more or less, of all the seeds that we're going to use during the course of the year. There was no historical archive concerning what was grown at Heligan at all. So it comes back to the situation that we've had to adopt, or I've had to adopt all the time, is to put myself in the position of being the head gardener and saying, okay, what would I have grown? So I've done that. What's happened is that I probably found more varieties than I expected to, which probably means that we grow a greater range of varieties than the head gardener might have done, say, in 1900.
Well, these are second early potatoes, which we would like to have got in a couple of weeks ago if we could, but the weather hasn't been favourable. So it's a bit behind. It's not the end of the world. Although, what are we now? Almost end of March. It's not late for these, but we would like to have got them in earlier.
These are all the varieties of first early and second early potatoes and salad potatoes that we've still got to put in. How quickly they're going to sprout, I'm not sure. All these potatoes have been chitted. That is, that they've been stood on their ends and stood in the fruit room for a while, for 2 or 3 months, in order to produce shoots. And the varieties that we're growing, we've got of these earlies, first earlies and salads, something of the order of 15 or 16 varieties, all of which are period correct. That is pre-1910, and they're the sort of varieties that Victorian Edwardian head gardeners would have used. I'd never seen these before. There's a variety called salad red and a variety called salad blue. You can see how blue the shoots are, and in fact you can just about see how dark the skin is, even if you can't see it's blue. But what's interesting about it is that when you cut it, look at that, bluey purple flesh, and the other one's got, here's salad red. Doesn't look too happy on the end there, does it? But you can see the colour. The rotational sequence in here, which we have over a couple of years more or less worked out a standard cropping programme for the vegetable garden now. We know what's going where, what spacing it's going at, and basically what varieties we'll use. The head gardener would have made the decisions about the balance of what was going to be grown and what was going to grow where, because it was his responsibility to keep the kitchens going in the house. And the foreman was the one who actually implemented things on the ground in general. However, I am sure that in those days, like it would be today, that there would have been a certain amount of discussion between the foreman and the head gardener about what was practical to do. One of the other things that we're very keen on and tended to be laughing about in the early stages when we started this garden was the regimentation and exactitude with which we plant things out. That was how the Victorians did it. When the plants came up, you expected them to stand there like little rows of guardsmen and salute, and not be at an angle or one row closer than another. And now it's second nature to everybody that they understand that if the rows, say, 18 inches apart, rows are 18 inches apart. If they have to be thinned to 6 inches apart, they are thinned to 6 inches apart. That's what we mean by day-to-day implementation of things, don't we?
Yes.
I'm thinning parsnips here. I'm thinning them to about 3 inches. Those will grow on, and then in a few months' time we'll actually thin them to about 6 inches. They'll actually grow at that. There is more mind-numbingly boring jobs in this garden, but this isn't a bad job actually. There's far worse jobs than this. So obviously, but I don't say that it is a really brilliant job, otherwise I'll be doing it all the time and it would be boring.
They didn't have means of preserving food as we do these days. And so therefore food that dries and stores well was an important part of the winter diet. And peas and beans, which do both. And therefore were a very versatile crop. You see, the thing is that these days the different types of pea and bean have improved so much. I mean, you know what a packet of bird's eye peas tastes like? They're really good. They're sweet, small, very juicy. The olden time peas are great big fat bullets that taste nothing at all. I think it's the same with a lot of the broad beans too. But we've picked ones that we feel illustrate the successional cropping, sort of an autumn sown crop, and an early season crop and a late season crop.
What I would like is to be sure that the rotational sequence that I've tried to establish and plan really is working properly. Last year was the first year of its operation. It's very easy to run before you can walk if you're not careful and keep on having new horizons, new ambitions of where you're going to move on to. But horticulturally, every so often you just have to stand back and say, let's get everything sorted and make sure we haven't missed out on anything. It's important to do it, otherwise the thing doesn't work. Then that takes time. That takes a whole year of sequences, seasonal sequences.
The flower garden grew swathes of cut flowers to decorate the big house and produced exotic fruits in its range of glass houses. Restored only 2 years ago, this 19th century garden is unique in Britain.
This is a Paxton house named for Sir Joseph Paxton, of course, who built the Crystal Palace. He had this bright idea in the 1840s that the average house owner, the middle class house owner, should have their own glass houses. So he produced the first kit off-the-shelf glass house. The glass, which was made on a barrel process, was very narrow, so there were lots of glazing bars. And what you didn't want was the water running down the glass alongside the glazing bars, simply because it would cause it to rot more quickly. So that it was cut on this curved fashion, so that on the slope the water runs down the glass, keeping away from the wood, thus preserving it. Very simple piece of kit. You could build it as a lean-to like this one, or you could build it two from either side, making a ridge house. It was the very first kit off-the-shelf glass house that anybody could buy, and perhaps surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, because it's sort of ephemera, very, very few of these things survive. They've nearly all disappeared amongst the thousands that were probably sold, and maybe this is the only actual working one left in the country, restored and working.
The glass houses were strategically placed on a southwest aspect, and the beds intentionally sloped to maximise the warmth of the early morning sun. It makes an ideal place to grow exotic fruits, a diligently arranged supply of salad vegetables, and crop after crop of flowers. A late spring frost killed off one of their peonies, so Tom is improvising. Helping him is Gillian Cartwright, who's responsible for cultivating the flowers.
That's going to look great. The bender. Up goes the bender.
Got to shelter in it when it rains. Or hide in it.
Well, we're putting up our teepee for sweet peas. We've got most of the sweet peas up. You can see them in that row of pea sticks. That's in the cut flower bed. But we lost a peony out of the peony row here, and so we've got to fill up with a nice little triangle to fill with sweet peas.
Is this all we've got, Tom?
Those are the Cupanis originals.
OK, let's just enough, I think.
How many shoots are you choosing? 2, is it?
Just 2, yeah. Actually, we better...
Pinch out the weaker shoots.
That's right.
Choose 2, maybe?
Yeah. Apparently about 400 WI ladies coming today. Look around the garden.
They'll enjoy that. flowers grown in here would have gone into the house on request, almost entirely, and year round as well. So early spring bulbs all through summer. We're going to try and get 3 crops in this year if we can, depending on the weather.
We've got a piece of ground which is effectively divided into half by the east-west path. On the north side of it, we've planted the early crop, and we're exactly mirroring it on the other side now with our main crop sowing. The whole thing just runs through in a straight line, and that was part of the sort of Victorian system, and it was all done with precision. We're going to sow these annual cut flowers, Gillian. Start here inside the cleomes with the clarkias and the godetias. This soil has been partially knocked down, so all I want you to do, please, is to rake it out, get it good and level. It's already beginning to dry, which I'm quite surprised about, but nevertheless it is coming down nicely. The difference between the varieties that would have been grown 100 years ago and the ones that you might have grown today commercially are simply a question of size, how tall they are. And these old varieties are much, much taller. And in many ways, I think, prettier and that much more enjoyable for it. They're aesthetically, to me, more pleasing. Whether there are any lessons to be learned from the way the Victorians did it in today's conditions is difficult to say, except that by demonstrating what we're doing now may bring back to people the ideas of how you could extend the season and the variety that you could achieve as a result of that. Because if you were growing cut flowers at home, it would be possible to have a succession of different sorts of flowers. If you only had the one season when they were flowering, let's say in late June and July, and then they were finished, you wouldn't be very popular in the house because probably people would be coming down here in August, September. So you'd need to have the flowers. So you've got to have this succession of cropping. So perhaps we could think back to those sort of things today and realise what we've forgotten.
Back in the vegetable garden, the salad red and salad blue potatoes are nearly ready for harvesting. Tom and Mike, an under gardener, are assessing if they need to be sprayed with Bordeaux mixture, a chemical that combats potato blight.
Snowdrop and salad red, that got ridged out. We shouldn't have done that. And the last 3 are salads.
Yeah.
So Lord Rosebery, King Edward, and Edsel Blue is all coming out this week.
Yeah, so there's no point in doing them, is there?
Mike, you want to start on the end.
Start out this end and work in.
Start on these salads and work in.
Yeah, right.
So the end 3 can... Oh, hell, look at this. We've got to do this week, haven't we?
Yes, we certainly have, haven't we?
Bloody hell.
Yeah.
We're practising systems that were used in late Victorian, early Edwardian times. I would prefer to use organic systems, but there are some crops which mightn't do as well as normal if they didn't have non-organic treatments. I mean, Bordeaux mixture to treat blight on potatoes, for example, is allowed under organic principles, but I would prefer not to use it.
Right. So I start right here now, shall I? Yeah.
When you get high temperatures and high humidity, you get conditions perfect for the spread of blight. So you must spray Bordeaux mixture, which is a preventative measure. And so we have to do it once a fortnight. Well, this is a damping down process that we have to do a lot through the summer months, especially with these cucumbers. Keep the bed nice and wet. It keeps down the red spider mite, which is a big problem in glasshouse crops, especially on these, which have huge leaves and the mites spread fast. They like hot, dry conditions, so if we can get the place nice and damp, the floor as well and the walls, then it helps to keep them down. Victorians would have kept this glasshouse soaking wet all the time, damped it down. They had any amount of labour, young boys to come in and do this sort of thing 7 days a week. We had a dry winter, very, very cold. We lost a lot of stuff. We then moved on into an extremely dry spring. And now we're getting a sort of wettish midsummer with poor light levels, which means that, you know, the difficult growing season continues. So anyway, we're rained off today and we're in here doing these croissants. But no, I'm not disappointed. It's difficult. That's half the fun of gardening, trying to combat all these, how do you say that word, combat, what does it mean? How do you pronounce it, do you know? Anyway, so we're trying to get over it.
August, and the moment of truth.
Still looking for the elusive flower bud.
It's all been somewhat of a bit of a disaster, but it's recovering nicely.
Well, they have picked up well, despite the fact we've had poor summer.
We really just, well, not exactly failed, but we didn't do the best we can.
Well, we lost a good few because of the condensation dripping down into the centre of the plant and the cold getting in on top of that. We lost a lot.
We'll probably have to redo our hotbeds 3 times this winter instead of twice. Hell of a lot of labour to have to dig all these out and manure them with hot material. But if we're really going to keep the temperature up in this pit during the winter, it's the only way we're going to do it.
But I suspect this is a full-time job for a couple of people, almost solely, doing nothing else. And that, of course, we find difficult to fit into our schedule. Still.
It's interesting, I mean, how we've struggled to get where we have and learnt all we have along the way. And to think that these chaps were producing pineapples that varied between 12 and 18 pounds each. And the care and attention that must have gone into maintaining the temperature, maintaining the growth, feeding them, watering them. There must have been people looking after them almost continuously.
It's not all been failures. The end of the summer and the gardens are bursting with produce. True to the Victorian tradition of extending the season, the 16 varieties of potatoes sown back in March are still being lifted. The salad red and salad blue were the last in line. As soon as one crop comes out, another goes in. This time it's winter cabbage, protected by a seaweed mulch, which also acts as a repellent to the cabbage root fly.
In 1995, we had our first full year of using the whole productive garden. And that then set us on the road of thinking about what we would do with this produce. It's the intention that the crops would be harvested as and when they were ready. In other words, as and when the big house would have taken them.
Tonight it's the grand feast, this time for the Heligan staff. Just as in the days of the Tremaines, Tom has to discuss menus with the cook.
Morning, Tom.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Are you?
Good. Not too bad.
One feast menu.
Right, we're all set.
What have we got? What haven't we got?
Now, 5 pounds of carrots.
Yes,
We
please.
can arrange that, that's no problem.
Good. And plenty of
onions and celery.
Yeah, we've got all that.
To make some stock, yeah.
Plenty of that.
Plenty of French beans and spinach.
French beans we've got loads. We've got all different colours. We've got purples, light yellows, greens, all sorts. So we bring you a mix of those.
Smashing, yeah. Spinach and chard.
Yeah, we've got lots of both of those.
Smashing, okay. And fresh fruits, soft fruits.
Yeah, we've got all the currants. Yeah, we've got gooseberries, red
raspberries.
currants, white currants, raspberries, so that's okay.
Lovely.
We've got everything ready, haven't we?
We've got everything.
What about the potatoes?
Yes, please. Yeah, plenty of potatoes.
Yeah, and we'll try and get you those blue and red
The blue and red
ones.
ones, yeah.
So we'll get that up to you as soon as we can.
Smashing.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
For Gillian, it's her private moment of glory. The flowers that she sowed back in June are ready for harvest. In Victorian times, these would have taken pride of place on the Tremaine's top table. Nearly 100 years later, it's as if time has stood still.
Nowadays, running the garden in a Victorian tradition is only in terms of the plants and the methods we use. There is no similarity within the way the labour is used or the way the labour is organised. In a Victorian garden, there was a very definite hierarchy. Head gardener through foreman, right down to garden boy. It had its own levels of knowledge, which were not passed down to levels below you. It's all part of the muck and magic myth syndrome, which gave you your position. And people worked long hours. Opportunities were small. Wages weren't high. Nowadays, wages still aren't high, but people work many hours less. The position of women in society generally is also reflected in horticulture. There's plenty of opportunity for women to go to the senior levels. So there's little or no comparison between the people who are working in the garden today and those who worked here in the old days. Having said that, what we're doing is still a homage to that tradition.
This project is going to go on at the level that it has been, the level of success that it's found in a short space of time.
You want to try some of these?
I'd love to. It needs a lot of enthusiasm and hard work and dedication. The idea is to get this garden into a situation whereby anyone can take it over and carry on the good work that we've started. Chard makes a good replacement for spinach, doesn't it? It says spinach. So I would think that the next 3 or 4 years would be a time of great importance to make it into a place that people continue to want to come to and derive pleasure from.
I'm really thinking we were debating whether you were going to get a telegram from the Queen this year or next year.
No, that wasn't nice. No.
100 years ago, a reviewer wrote in the Gardener's Chronicle, "Any visit to Heligan would be quite incomplete without mentioning Mrs. Tremaine's sundial garden." This is a very charming enclosure of about 1/4 of an acre, filled with all kinds of old-fashioned flowers, which produce a gay succession from January through to December. He described it as the finest herbaceous border in the country. Today, its glorious past is only a memory, derelict after decades of neglect.
First job, that beech tree's coming down. When that's on the ground, it's going to be cut up in the dumper and across to the fire. quick as we can so we can then start slushing all this lot down. Once we get that flat, I should bring the digger in and we'll scrape right over the whole site. Right, we get on then, shall we?
Annabelle Walton, just 27 years old, has the prestigious job of heading the gardening team.
As head gardener of the pleasure grounds, this garden is going to be my responsibility to plan and lay out and look after in the future. So at the moment, I'm just trying to make sure everyone knows what they're doing and we're cutting down the right things and leaving the things we're supposed to leave.
John Nelson has masterminded the logistics behind all the restoration work at Heligan.
My main job in this garden now is going to be literally doing all the hard landscaping right at the stage whereby the actual planting takes place. We've got the paths to do, the lawns to level, borders to level. There is an awful lot of work to be done. There's something like 5,500 bricks to be laid into the paths, which isn't done in 5 minutes. But in actual time, it'll be around about 6 or 7 weeks. But with a good team, I'm sure that we'll get it done.
Yes? There's a vine in there that we need to save, so I'll just point it out.
Yeah, fine. See those ferns?
No, it's this.
I hope I haven't cut it already.
There's very little of value left in here, really. I mean, most of it's just overgrown with brambles and dockweed and that sort of thing. There's one or two that are original plants. This is Stauntonia, which is one of the original vines that would have been on the wall. So we're going to try and salvage that. This one tree that we're going to keep in the garden is called Davidia involucrata, and it's from China. And its nickname is the handkerchief tree or the ghost tree. It has these two big white bracts that hang down either side. Bracts are like leaves. They hang down either side of the flower. And it looks just like a handkerchief. Once this garden's completed, this is going to be a really good focal point.
Toby Musgrave and Chris Gardner are responsible for the new design. They're the ones that have condemned the self-seeded beech tree, as the shade would stifle the growth of the new plants.
What we wanted to do at Heligan was to recreate a border, herbaceous border, about 1880, which predated anything that Gertrude Jekyll did. Unfortunately, we don't have much evidence of the herbaceous border at Heligan, a few photographs and one article. So my job was to go away and research pre-1880 herbaceous borders in libraries and look at books and magazines. From that, we found that there were various styles being proposed by various different authors at the time. And I think Chris is the chap who can tell you exactly what we found and how we adapted it.
Yeah, I mean, what happened basically was the variety of styles were blended together. So what we have is plants roughly in rows, but in groups, with wall shrubs backing them all. And the overall effect is this foliar sort of luxuriance, plenty of colour throughout the year. There's no strict colour scheme. We use lots of pinks and blues and a few sort of bright spots of reds and yellows where appropriate. And up the top here we have a small circular step, and the pavement material there is intentionally different because we want to make the whole garden look distinct.
Now the ground is cleared, John can begin landscaping the new garden. Annabelle's main job over winter is to get the 10-foot wide herbaceous border ready for planting.
Well, the soil preparation is going to be the task that's going to take the longest time this winter. It's absolutely crucial that we do it well because the whole success of the borders depends on doing this bit properly. We found an awful lot of rubbish in there. I mean, the borders haven't been touched for probably at least 50 years. So there was a lot of root penetration from the brambles, from all the self-seeded trees that had grown up. So there was a lot of rubbish to get out of the soil. And then basically you incorporate as much organic matter as you can into the soil. The work that we're doing will hopefully guarantee the health of the plants for a long time to come. because a herbaceous border, you don't rip it out and re-dig every year like you can with a vegetable garden, you know, to keep the soil fertility up and so on. In say 4 years' time, it'll be about time to take out all the plants and you lift and divide herbaceous plants to retain their vigour.
Mid-November, and John's 6-week deadline to finish all the hard landscaping is nearly up.
Rather late in the day now, but I should just about complete, I think. Very time-consuming. It doesn't look a lot left, but in actual fact, there's still 2 or 3 hours work involved. And basically then, we're ready for the gardening. I would think about another 10 days and we're complete.
In the near-freezing temperatures of March, the team finished preparing the flower beds before the plants they've ordered arrive.
OK, what have you got? The lime?
Yeah.
And you've got the Vitex. OK, what we're going to need to do is a sort of light dressing of both on the surface of the soil. And then if Mary, you can sort of rake up behind them, rake it into the surface. Yeah, you can pick up any odd stones and stuff that we've missed and get the bumps and hollows out of it, really. So then we should be ready for marking out after that. OK. Well, the next stage, once we've finished raking this level, will be to mark it out. And this is our beautiful plan here. And what it involves, basically, all these blobs along this side represent the clumps of herbaceous plants that have got to go in here. So to get the layout right of the plants, I need to sort of measure these and draw them out in sand on the bed. Which is there. Fantastic. There we go. And that's a funny shape, that one. It's like, what's that, about 1.7 along and about just over a metre
really, isn't it?
out. I mean, we're not trying to be that accurate, really. It's just a sort of vague, well, not vague, we're just trying to get the general spread of the plants right. That's why we're sort of doing the back row first. I mean, we could work sort of front to back and do it section by section, but I want to make sure we've got the sort of right spread lengthways. I mean, when the plants arrive, we'll obviously have to sort of arrange them within that kind of space.
The plants are being delivered by Carol Klein from Glebe Cottage Nurseries. Staying true to the spirit of this restoration, all the plants are old-fashioned varieties, typical of what would have been grown in an 1880 herbaceous border.
Well, yeah.
Oh, excellent. My God, it doesn't look enough, does it? When you look at it, you think that enormous border. It will be, though.
Yeah, well, each of these little things is going to grow into something fairly massive.
Into something huge and spectacular. And
yes, in a very short space of time.
As the bitterly cold weather of early spring melts away, the old Davidia tree, to mark the warmer days, throws out its handkerchiefs. The Stauntonia is the only other original planting in the garden, and now it's tied back, it's romping away. For the gardeners, there's one more vital task to perform.
Right, well, this is the lawn, and we've dug it over and we've raked it once to get all the stones and all the crap out of it. And basically we've got to tread it because it's got to be nice and firm for the lawn seed to be sown onto it. So I'll go first. Best foot forward. OK. And you look really, really stupid. It's called synchronised stepping, which is going to be made an Olympic sport, I've been told. The nation with the largest feet will obviously come first. We need a music tape, actually, don't we? So like a family of ducks. Right, turn around. Shuffle up. Okay, I'll go this way.
The next job is to retrieve their lost sundial. John Nelson has persuaded the current owners of Heligan House to allow it to be taken back to its old home.
Well, that'll do lovely. Right, sir. Right, now, Annabelle. The markings. The markings there were very evident on the photograph, weren't
They're
they?
facing a certain way, doesn't it?
Yeah, pop down and just see on the photograph which way they were facing.
There's a big white blob on one of the corners.
Yep.
And that has to face away from this direction.
That is right how it is.
Well, I think that'll do then.
Looking perfect. Perfect.
I think there's been quite a lot of unrealistic expectations about this garden, how it's supposed to look magnificent in its first year. And I'm astonished and delighted to say that it is looking pretty good already. The Doronicums were the first ones out. They're beautiful butter yellow. The Veronicas, the bees and butterflies have been all over ever since the first flower appeared. This border, the size of it, it needs some really large stately plants, so the campanula, which is over 6 foot tall now, really fills a good space. And there's a Strantia major, which is a lovely cottage garden plant. It's got several nicknames, including Hattie's Pincushion and Melancholy Gentleman.
The sundial top itself, which the stonemason is now carving, that's going to be put in position with the sundial on the top. So we haven't really got a lot of time at all. It's been chasing the clock.
The moment of truth, the opening. The guest of honour is Damaris Tremaine, who remembers the original garden from her childhood.
What you will be seeing, hopefully, on the other side of this is a garden which is seeking to celebrate 100 years after the article in Gardener's Chronicle which stated that the herbaceous border at Heligan was the finest in the land. And I think you'll see that its start is lovely. We've already discovered some flaws which we'll be putting right, so we ask you to be gentle in your criticism, because most of the things that you might say we've been far harsher about ourselves, and the real tasting of this will be over the years to see whether it really does fulfill its potential.
What do you think? I brought these things here when they were little teeny plants. They came from my nursery, and I'm just amazed to see them grown up so well. Well, it's not me, it's the plants and the people here. Can you see it inside? See the pineapples coming? It's called a pineapple plant. It's gorgeous, isn't it?
The last thing one might expect to find in the middle of the Cornish countryside is a jungle. Yet this is what the Tremaine family created within the lost gardens of Heligan.
If anybody could see me now, they'd think I was really enjoying it, wouldn't they?
As we've excavated through here and taken out hundreds and hundreds of self-sown trees, we found underneath them these wonderful tree ferns, over 60 different varieties of bamboos, and a lot of specimen trees. And what we're basically doing here is returning it to its former glory, but with the added spice, of course, that the Tremaine family who conceived this garden never saw it at its best, because they departed before everything had reached maturity. So we actually have the privilege of seeing it as they never had.
The idea of the jungle was to provide a contrast to the formality of the other gardens at Heligan. The slope of the valley, combined with the mild temperatures of Cornwall, have created a microclimate where subtropical plants flourish. The collection of exotica was brought back by the great Victorian plant hunters from all corners of the globe. Their collections changed the face of the British landscape. This garden was created by Squire John Claude Tremaine in the late 1880s. Mike Helliwell is the new head gardener, who now is responsible for the care of these rare plants.
Yeah, could do. There's 4 of us working in the jungle. I've got Dave Burns, who's a recently retired seaman, James Hurd, who is a middle year student, and Ken, I don't know what his surname is, to be honest, Kenneth, who's been here since day one. He started in October of '91 when the first clearance began up the top. Yes, the one. Right, you're heading down there.
Today, Mike's removing unwanted ivy 40 foot up in the air from this trachycarpus.
Yep, right. It's gardening on the grand scale. You know, we're the largest restoration project in Europe, and the jungle itself, just one of the parts of the estate, is 25 acres. So it's a very large ongoing process. The poor thing has been strangled for the best part of 100 years. So we're going to prune the worst of it off. What we can't do is drag every single piece out, because it takes away all of the fibrous outer coating of the tree, which is all part of the appeal and the frost protection. So we prune off the bulk of it and then leave the last of it to rot and fall off naturally in the course of time. The ivy started to take over when the gardens were abandoned somewhere around the beginning of the First World War. Obviously, any garden, any piece of land has a certain amount of ivy in it, and it spreads unless kept under control. And whenever it finds something that it can climb up it goes. It won't physically strangle a tree. What can happen is either that it will get so very heavy that the weight of it drags the tree over, and in this particular case that's quite a possibility if we don't get it finished soon.
The illusion of real jungle relies on a wild appearance, but it's a fine line between luxuriant growth and chaos. Kenneth wages a constant war on invaders.
And Ken's very good at doing those repetitive on and on jobs that are part and parcel of this kind of garden. I do sometimes actually feel sorry for him, but it's a job that has to be done, and he's very capable, and very suitable for doing that sort of work.
It's just something that's got to be done, and I don't mind doing it because I work on my own. I like working in the garden and that. You can see what you've done at the end of the day.
The legacy of its derelict past may still be causing Kenneth problems, but after 2,000 of the self-set sycamore and ash were removed, the jungle took on a new lease of life. With the dense tree canopy gone, the sunlight could finally penetrate. British wildflowers germinated and bloomed after decades of dormancy, creating bizarre contrasts with their subtropical neighbours. Accustomed to the gloom, there was a concern that the light would be too much for these Australian tree ferns. The reverse proved to be the case. They burst into life alongside the bamboos, which doubled in size. Despite the flourishing plants, the restoration work goes on.
Don't, for Christ's sake, drop it.
Like a little baby.
Perfectionist John Nelson is determined to create not just the look, but the sound of the jungle through a series of waterfalls.
Because the whole idea of this is to get a lovely bit of noise of the water falling and crashing down the valley. To create that lovely atmosphere that water does. The valley's lacking it at the moment, and yeah, that lovely little ripple's going to make all the difference, I think. Especially in the still of the evening, early morning.
Yeah.
That lovely little trickle, crash of water. And during the winter months, of course, it will be a roar.
Yeah, it will.
Because this really does get lively.
It was originally, ironically, called the Orchard. The early postcards that we found dated from 1870, 1880, that sort of time, refers to it as the Orchard in inverted commas, because what happened was they converted what was a large area of Cornish orchard into what we now know as the Jungle Garden. And I believe that what happened was that John Claude, when he took over in early 1900, changed its name to the Japanese Garden because Japanese gardening was all the rage. I mean, they associated Japanesery with bamboos, the linear nature bamboos and water. It had precious little else to do with being Japanese than that.
Weeding at Heligan is a perennial activity. For Kenneth, it takes many forms.
As you can see, the blanket weed is all over the place. If I don't clear it up every now and again, blanket weed, it goes and kills everything off because it takes the oxygen out of water. It's all right in some respects, but no good for anything that lives in water.
Mike has a more pleasant task for the day, hanging out these staghorn ferns.
Staghorn ferns come from the South Pacific, from sort of Australia and New Zealand round to Madagascar. They're tree dwellers or epiphytes, which means that they don't have any roots as such. They collect all the food and water that they want in these leaves. We've got leaves, we've got bird droppings, dust, pollen, anything that comes along, rainwater. The leaves that we've got here are all sterile, they're vegetative to trap all the goodness that the plant wants. Later on we'll get the strap-like leaves coming down that produce the spores and give it the common name, if you think about a stag's antlers. The Latin name is Platycerum bifurcatum. Bi means divides in two. It's not hardy. These have been in the greenhouse all winter, but they should do very nicely out here in the shade on the north side of the tree through the summer.
For the public, part of the garden's attraction is the storytelling tradition started by an enthusiastic Tim Smith and his team.
You see the big-leaved rhododendron? Yeah. Next to it is a very unprepossessing plant which has got flowers on it. Yeah. This is Drimys winteri, one of the most unusual plants on Earth, because Drimys winteri is named after James Winter, Captain James Winter, who was second in command to Sir Francis Drake on the circumnavigation of the globe. And as they were going through the Straits of Magellan at Tierra del Fuego, his troops were getting mutinous because they were all suffering from scurvy. And he saw the Tierra del Fuegan Indians on the coast making a soup out of the bark of this tree, so he thought he'd give it a punt. That it was a miracle that James Winter wasn't lynched immediately from the yardarm, because what he likened its flavour to being rhubarb to the power of 10. so that your tongue would stick instantly to your upper palate and remain there for the rest of the week. You know? But what Winter had discovered, or not to be politically incorrect, what the Tierra del Fuegan Indians had discovered, was the most vitamin C rich plant on Earth.
In the days of the Tremaines, being able to show off new plant species was an important part of life for the landed families all over the country. These rhododendrons were donated by another Cornish family from Sir Joseph Hooker's expedition in the middle 1800s.
the Lemon family at Carclew, which is from where we got most of the original Hooker rhododendron seeds. They got them from Kew and from Joseph Hooker direct from the expeditions. And they were, of course, related to the Tremaines by marriage, and they would have given any excess that they had to the Tremaines. Plant exchanges in the old days were much more civilised affairs. Not that I'm implying that this isn't civilised, but you'd normally sort of meet up and families would exchange seeds that they had been given. Very casual. It was like stamp collecting really in those days. And the passion got bigger and bigger and bigger the more plants came into the country and captivated the interest of more people.
A good show out of them there.
Yes.
Back in April, the gunnera, a native to the South American rainforest, was woken up from its winter dormancy. The new growth comes from the crown, which was protected over winter by having a layer of its own leaves wrapped around it.
With a leaf that's 6 or 8 feet across. Look, there's the stem. Remains of it was like that.
Late summer, and the gunnera is now fully grown.
Leaves, rubbish, tidied up a little bit. Have a look to see how much.
What about
the
Japanese knotweed again? The time that was got rid of.
Yeah,
before
we'll pull some of that too.
The maintenance of the jungle goes on all year round. Today the gardeners are clearing out the gunnera's damaged and dying leaves.
There's a dead one just over your head, nearly all dead. That's the one, yeah, we'll have a shot of him.
All right.
Oh yes, that can go, that's a good one.
The leaves grow every year, don't they?
That's right. Spread out from scratch.
How big is the base at the beginning? How small are these?
Well, these lumps you see here.
Here's one. That's where it'll sprout from next year. Already there, ready to grow away. Can you take one round to your left? You take that one away.
All right, I'll just put this down here. So long as I don't put it down where it gets misplaced again.
Quite so.
I'd say the leaf is about 6 foot across, wouldn't you say, Mike?
Yes, it's about that, isn't it, Ken?
That's what the size the leaf grow in every year, don't they? Oh. Almost like upside down umbrella. It's different. Like everything in this garden. If you look around long enough, you always find something different.
I know it sounds kind of casual to lose 30 acres of formal gardens, but that's in fact what happened here. For more than 150 years, these gardens had lain fallow, and we'd taken them to be just ordinary English woodland until, by a bit of research, we discovered that we were looking at miles and miles of formal Georgian gallops and rides. And even more excitingly, there were several big features, most notably what we take to be a series of lakes which were interlinked. And one of our great thrills is going to be trying to put it all back together again and see what it looks like.
The Lost Valley is part of 300 acres of dense woodland that surround the lost gardens of Heligan. In Georgian times, rides and gallops wove their way through these leafy glades, providing a private playground for the Tremaine family, the inhabitants of the big house. Today, decades of unchecked growth has completely obscured its glorious past.
By the end of January,
With no original maps to go on, Tim and John have assembled a team of experts to try and piece together a picture of the past.
When we first walked through here, when we were doing our first visual survey, we were completely persuaded that we were looking through the remnants of an old wood with a lot of new regeneration. But it was pretty impenetrable. But we didn't think to question it further because the garden there didn't appear on any plan. It predates the first plans we have for the garden.
What we could be looking at here then is where they took a lot of the timber out during the last war, didn't they?
Yeah,
from this wood.
So that's a regrowth of that?
It could be the regrowth from that,
Both
yeah.
First and Second World War, I think, as well.
Right.
It's very often needless like answer.
The Lost Valley was not just a leisure area. Heligan had to be self-sustaining. Tim and John found plenty of evidence that the woods were coppiced. The larger timber was used for building work around the estate, and the remainder turned into charcoal for fuel. As far back as 1625, records show how the Tremaines used local labour to produce charcoal in Heligan woods. Today they're charcoal-burning sycamore and ash, the trees which have self-set since the valley was abandoned. The decision to reintroduce the practice was not nostalgia for a lost tradition. For John Nelson, it offers practical advantages.
We could get the wood out the valley, but it's still no purpose behind it other than firewood at the end of the day. And it's far easier to take it out as charcoal, which is a third of the weight, than what it is to take it out in timber. It does make a lot of sense, doesn't it? The process really is you stack the kiln, you pour your fire down the centre, get it lit. As it burns away, gradually slide the lid over, and you'll find that the smoke turns into steam. And it's amazing what comes off of it. Once that turns into a nice blue smoke, you put the lid down and seal the lid right up. Hopefully after that 4 days you should have charcoal.
The clearance work continues into early summer. A team of dray horses are removing the bigger timber for use in building work around the estate. They're using horses because heavy machinery would damage the old pathways.
You can really see the landscape taking form, especially this dam here. I mean, that's great because this dam links up the entrance from the fields up there. You see the sunken road there.
And runs back down through. Yeah,
with the one behind us.
Come on, Bob. Come on, Bob. Get on, Bob.
It was a proper network of roads and rides, wasn't it?
Mm. I think that's great, you see, because these drawings, they show you the lake with this sort of disappear and shimmy around the back there. They're making a real feature of that oak you saved. It's really nice. No, I think that's
and
terrific.
to see this water disappearing around the corner right beyond the oak is going to be absolutely amazing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the effect is going to be bloody stunning, because, but here and here, you're going to have these beech trees reflecting in the water.
That's right.
Get up. Get up.
The restoration philosophy in the Lost Valley is a composite, and it's not possible to restore it to any particular period, because it really did evolve so much. So we have to, if you like, establish a spirit of place, an atmosphere that we wish to evoke, using the framework that we like that's there, the gallops, the rides with the beech trees and oak avenues.
The mind can get really carried away in a valley like this. It's got to be secret. And I think if I put it back as we see it now completely, it wouldn't be secret. So I'm going to make it secret.
Even with the help of the digger, John Nelson has set himself another impossible deadline.
I think this valley, compared with the rest of the work we've carried out at Heligan, is different. I'm not saying it's the biggest job. It's not the biggest job by far, because the machine's going to do most of the work in here. But it's another challenge. It certainly is another challenge, and something different. Years ago, they wouldn't have had massive machines like this. It was done by hand. The luxury then was having the number of men, hundreds of men I expect, to dig a thing like this out and clay line it, build all these dams. There's waterways everywhere, all over the estate, all done by hand. In comparison, you take a job like this, going back to the times when it was first created, it would be years of work. I aim to do it with this machine 5 to 6 weeks, which is quite remarkable, isn't it? But it's going to be done. This is far from the final restoration of Heligan. I haven't even started. Phase 2 goes right the way up there, another 3/4 of a mile. And then, of course, we go downstream to another 300 and some odd acres. So there's a lot of excitement to come. Now I'm going to finish it, put the estate back as it was.
This isn't a setup, is it?
No, you're all right.
Perfect. Don't get your feet wet.
I don't intend to.
If you were to ask me whether I was amazed by what John's achieved in this short period of time, I'd have to say no, because I've seen him do it before. But in truth, I'm just really, really excited about what he's achieved. He's done, I think this is his finest work to date. I mean, he's really put his heart into it and driven everybody. I think there's a chance that by next season this will be the finest part of the garden, so that's a really exciting part to look forward to.
Very friendly.
I feel we've still got an awful lot to do. John has got a lot that he wants to do. It'd be easier to do this, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I'd like to play 2 roles, and both of them involve John and I working together. The first is that of keeper of the keys, which is to ensure that you don't turn it into a Ponzi garden. You've got to always be on guard against becoming average and doing the thing that everybody expects you to do. The second is I have one further challenge up my sleeve for John, which is we've put back the past.
Just one continental.
John's Valley that he's just restored is, if you like, a tantalising glimpse of the past reaching the present with a bit of modern interpretation. The final thing would be to take the valley that has not got a historic past to it, not part of the historic landscape, and really see whether we could make an amazing contribution to make a garden for the 21st century.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well done, John. Brilliant.
Don't want to stop the night, do we? Figure the shack on the rear. Reeded roof. And that's it.
That's right.
Double glazing. Bar in the middle. And we share it with the ducks.
No, this is a fine, fine proposal.
You get some good shrubbery going on, so it'll be thicken this right up. There's some beautiful trees down here. No question about that. Wait till nature starts doing its work. We get some reeds, rushes.
I can't wait.
It's going to be a paradise, isn't it?
Some critics claim that the lost gardens of Heligan no longer lives up to its name. Has the restoration gone too far?
It's very easy at certain stages in a restoration to feel as if you're losing the plot, that somehow the spirit that drove you to come to a place has somehow left you, deserted you, if you like. I think for us the major problem has been that the infrastructure was so damaged by a lot of the overgrowth that there was here that there was a contradiction between having it open to the public and enjoying it as a lost garden. So although we're called the Lost Gardens of Heligan, we have in many places had to restore, cut back, regrow to, if you like, capture the spirit that was there, but put the basic horticulture back. I would actually like, ideally, now that we've done the clearance and a lot of the restoration, to almost make it fall asleep anew, to get back even closer to where we were on the day we discovered it, but with a better balance horticulturally, more variety, more colour. The nooks and crannies are what it's all about. I believe a garden should be a wild and wonderful place and should somehow capture human spirit. It's the ultimate perversion, isn't it, of nature to actually create a garden. And if you're not perverse enough to make it really, really attractive, you're not really doing your job.